Nobody likes having a weakness, but we all love creating them, don't we?
Thank you, Boris. In this lecture, I'll be covering a most interesting topic, weaknesses and how to create them. So, what exactly is a weakness? A weakness is basically a positional defect which your opponent can exploit immediately, in the near future, or in the long run. As far as weakness creation goes, sometimes your opponent will weaken his position on his own and you won't need to do anything. But of course, this is very unlikely to happen, and normally you'll need to use one of the three techniques that I'll be talking about here. Let's see some examples. We already know about this mate, checkmate. White has played g4 and has weakened this diagonal, which black can exploit immediately by simply going queen to h4, and this is checkmate. f3 and g4 weaken the h4 to e1 diagonal. And this is an example of what I was talking about earlier, about your opponent making moves which weaken his position without you having to do anything. But as you can see, something like this is very unlikely to happen when you play against a strong player. Now, let's imagine that we have many more pieces on the board. I'm going to explain what a weak pawn is. This pawn on d5 is isolated and we can attack it. And if there are no pawns on the sides, black will not be able to defend it. That's why we call this pawn an isolated pawn. Now watch the difference. This time, and again I'm asking you to imagine that black has many other pieces on the board. If we go rook to d1, black can defend that pawn by simply going c6. And here you can tell the difference between an isolated pawn and a group of pawns which can defend each other. Now, in this position, the pawn on d6 is a rather weak pawn because it cannot be protected by another pawn. And that pawn, that backward pawn, is on a half-open file. And this means that white can simply pile up his rooks along this file, like maybe white will go rook to d3 and then put his other rook there. And on top of that, there's a major weakness on the d5 square. The d5 square is a rather weak square. It's what we normally call an outpost. And that square can be occupied by the knight, and that knight cannot be kicked away by a pawn because there are no pawns on the side. So there are two basic defects in black's position here. The d5 square, a major weakness, and the pawn on d6, a backward pawn. Alright, this time we're going to be seeing a weak diagonal. We're attacking this pawn and black tries to protect it. But this is a risky move because those pawns can be attacked now with this move, a4, undermining those pawns, trying to destroy them. If black now goes c6, big blunder, we take. Now watch this diagonal. It's become a rather weak diagonal and white can simply go queen to f3 and white's winning material. Here's another example of a weak diagonal. Here, black takes on d5, and now white should play knight to c3, attacking the queen and getting the tempo. But instead, he played b3, a double question mark move, because now look at this diagonal, a rather weak diagonal, and black will simply go queen to d4, and white's losing material. Now, we're going to see a weak file. White now plays h3 and black tries this interesting move. So maybe you're thinking, well, how about if we take that bishop? Well, this is what happens. Pawn takes, and now this file has become really weak for white, because if this knight moves out of the way, like here for example, the queen comes to h4, look at those two major pieces and threatening checkmate. The only way to stop it is by advancing this pawn, so that if black goes queen to h1 or queen to h2, then the king can run away. But here we play g3, and next move is going to be checkmate. I mean, okay, maybe white can play this in between, but we take it, and then the next move is going to be checkmate. Okay, so next position. And earlier on I mentioned that your opponent is not going to weaken his position on his own. Sometimes we'll need to use a different technique. And here the technique that we're going to use is a sacrifice. Here black can sacrifice his queen. This pawn is pinned. So white must take with his g-pawn, and now this diagonal has become weak and black can deliver a checkmate. So this is an example of using a sacrifice to create a weakness. Like here the knight is protecting, and if we don't get rid of the g-pawn, even if we take that knight, white will still be able to play g3. That's why after queen takes, pawn takes, forced, and now the weakness has been created. Another common technique to create a weakness is exchanging pieces and pawns. In this position, black has just played h6, which is not a very good move, because here we trade on f6. If he takes back with his queen, then we take here, he takes back, and we win a pawn with knight takes pawn. So he's pretty much forced to take with his g-pawn. And then this pawn structure looks alright. I must admit there's an isolated pawn there, but it's not easy to attack. So here what we're going to do is straight pawns on d5 like this. And when he takes back, look at those pawns. Those pawns are really weak now, particularly those two isolated and double pawns. That's just about the worst weakness you can get when it comes to pawns. Let's see another example. And the most interesting technique when it comes to weakness creation is the one that I'm going to explain now. Sometimes we need to make very simple threats to force our opponent to advance one of his pawns, and then a weakness has been created. Take a look at this position, for example. This knight is pinned. The knight is protected by this other knight and the queen and the king, of course. But white can win this position in just a couple of moves. Queen to f3, threatening checkmate. So the only way to defend against this is by going f6. But now look at that weakness. A weakness has been created, and then we go queen to h5, he goes g6, and here we simply take. We threaten the rook, we threaten a deadly discover check, and if he takes, of course, then queen takes is checkmate. So we've seen the different techniques used to create a weakness. Weakness creation is a big topic. The better you get, the more weaknesses you'll be able to find in your opponent's positions.